1943, the bizarre mission that made German spies lose all hope. Picture this, a freezing night in April 1943. You're standing in a dimly lit room in Berlin. Around you, Germany's finest intelligence operatives, men trained in deception, survival, and the deadly art of espionage. Tonight, they've intercepted what appears to be the most valuable communication of the entire conflict. A message from the Allies. A message that promises to reveal the secret plans for the invasion of Europe. But what these spies don't know yet, what they can't possibly imagine, is that this single night will destroy their confidence forever, because the Allies haven't made a mistake. They've set the perfect trap. This is the true story of Operation Mincemeat, the most audacious deception in military history. A mission so bizarre, so brilliantly conceived, that it made the German intelligence machine question everything they thought they knew. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single body, a briefcase, and a collection of fake documents changed the course of history, and how Germany's master spies realized in one crushing moment that they had already lost. Stay with me. This story will shock you. Chapter 1. The Desperate Situation, Tour 8. Let me take you back to early 1943. The situation for the Allies was critical. After years of fighting, they were finally ready to strike back against Fortress Europe. But there was one massive problem. Everyone knew where they would strike. Sicily, the Italian island sitting at the bottom of Europe like a football waiting to be kicked. It was obvious. Too obvious. The Germans knew it. The Italians knew it. Every military strategist on both sides understood that Sicily was the logical target. And that meant the beaches would be fortified, machine gun nests, artillery positions, thousands of troops waiting for the invasion. The casualties would be catastrophic. In a small office in London, British intelligence officers faced an impossible question. How do you hide an invasion when everyone knows where it's coming? The answer came from an unlikely source. His name was Charles Cholmondeley, a Royal Air Force officer with a wild imagination, and his colleague Ewan Montague, a brilliant naval intelligence officer who understood how the German mind worked. Together, they conceived a plan so outrageous that when they first proposed it, their superiors thought they had lost their minds. They would create a fake person, give him a fake identity, fill his briefcase with fake invasion plans, and then they would let the Germans find his body, but not just any body. This had to be perfect. Every detail had to be absolutely convincing, because German intelligence wasn't stupid. They had some of the sharpest analytical minds in Europe. One mistake, one tiny inconsistency, and the entire operation would collapse. The pressure was immense. Thousands of lives depended on getting this right. Young soldiers who would storm those beaches needed every advantage they could get. This deception had to work. The clock was ticking. The invasion was scheduled for July. That gave them less than 3 months to create a completely convincing fake identity, acquire a body, and plant it where the Germans would find it. Let me tell you exactly how they did it. Chapter 2. Creating the Perfect Lie. 8-16 now. First, they needed a body, and this was more complicated than you might think. They couldn't just use any deceased person. The body had to appear to have drowned recently. It had to be in the right condition. And, this is crucial, they needed permission from the family. Even in wartime, even for an operation this important, the British maintained certain ethical standards. After weeks of searching, they found their man, a 34-year-old Welsh laborer named Glyndwr Michael. He had died from accidentally ingesting rat poison. He had no close family, and critically, his body was in the right condition to appear as a drowning victim. But a body wasn't enough. They needed to create a complete human being. Someone so real that German intelligence would never question his existence. They named him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. And then they built his entire life. Think about your own wallet right now. What's inside it? Your identification, photos of loved ones, maybe some receipts, bus tickets, that theater stub from last month. These small, meaningless items that together tell the story of who you are. Cholmondeley and Montague understood this perfectly. They spent weeks creating Major Martin's life, one tiny detail at a time. They gave him a fiancée. Her name was Pam. They even had a photograph taken of a young woman from the office and placed it in his wallet. On the back, they wrote, "All my love, Pam." They added love letters, letters that would make any man smile, letters full of wedding plans, complaints about rationing, jokes about his forgetfulness. Real, human, believable letters. They put in his wallet a receipt from a jewelry store for an engagement ring. The bill was overdue. They added a stern letter from his bank about his overdraft. They included ticket stubs from a London theater, a bill from his club, an identity card with his photograph, carefully created using a photo of a man who looked similar to their body. But here's where it gets really clever. They even gave Major Martin a personality. The letters from Pam mentioned his sense of humor, his habit of working too late. The documents showed he was somewhat careless with money. He was patriotic but not fanatical, competent but not brilliant. In other words, he was exactly the kind of mid-level officer who might be entrusted with important documents, but might also be slightly careless. Every detail was considered. His uniform was authentic, properly worn to show it wasn't brand new. His underwear had the right laundry marks. His boots were scuffed in the places where real boots would be scuffed. They even created a previous history for him. Service records, transfer papers, everything a real officer would have. But the most important part was the briefcase, chained to his wrist. Inside, carefully placed documents that would tell the Germans exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The documents suggested that the invasion would come not in Sicily, but in Greece and Sardinia. Sicily was mentioned only as a cover story, a feint to draw German attention away from the real targets. The letters were addressed to high-ranking Allied commanders. They discussed troop movements, supply issues, and strategic concerns. They were written in the bureaucratic style that real military correspondents used. Boring, detailed, completely authentic. Now came the hardest part. They had to get the body to the right place, and they had to make absolutely certain the Germans would find it. Chapter 3. The Deployment. 16-24. The location was critical. They needed somewhere the body would wash ashore quickly before decomposition became too obvious. They needed a place where Spanish authorities would find it, because Spain, though officially neutral, was known to share information with German intelligence. They chose the coast near Huelva, Spain, a town where a German agent was known to operate. Perfect. On April 19, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast under cover of darkness. Inside a specially designed canister, packed in dry ice, was the body of Major William Martin. The crew removed the body carefully. They inflated his life jacket to ensure he would float. They checked every detail one final time. The briefcase was secured to his wrist. His uniform was properly arranged. Everything had to look like an officer who had died in a plane crash at sea. Lieutenant Bill Jewell, the submarine commander, said a brief prayer. Even though this wasn't a real burial, even though this man was already deceased, the moment carried weight. This body was about to become one of the most important operatives in the entire military operation. They slid the body into the cold Atlantic waters. For a moment, it floated beside the submarine. Then the current began to carry it toward shore. The submarine crew waited. They had to ensure the body was caught in the right current. After 30 minutes of observation, satisfied that the body was heading in the right direction, they submerged and disappeared into the darkness. Now came the hardest part of the entire operation, waiting. In London, Cholmondeley and Montague could do nothing but wait for news. Would the Spanish find the body? Would they notify the Germans? Would German intelligence examine the documents? Most importantly, would they believe what they read? Days passed with no word. The tension was unbearable. Every hour that passed increased the chance that the body had decomposed too much, or been eaten by sea creatures, or simply sunk without being discovered. Then, on April 30th, the message came through. A body had washed ashore near Huelva. The Spanish authorities had recovered it. A British vice consul had been notified. The Spanish conducted an autopsy. The local doctor concluded death by drowning. The body had been in the water for several days, consistent with a plane crash at sea. The briefcase was still attached to his wrist. But here's what made British intelligence nervous. The briefcase had been opened, the documents had been photographed by Spanish officials, and everyone knew that Spanish officials shared intelligence with the Germans. The British acted their part perfectly. The naval attaché in Madrid made urgent demands for the return of Major Martin's body and all his possessions. He sent increasingly frantic messages about the sensitive documents. His anxiety was genuine, but for a different reason than the Spanish suspected. The British wanted the Germans to know these documents were valuable. Every demand, every urgent message, every sign of British concern was designed to convince German intelligence that these papers were the real thing. And it worked. The documents were photographed and passed to the German intelligence network in Spain. From there, they traveled to Berlin. But now came the real test. Would the Germans believe what they were reading? Chapter 4. The German Reaction. 24 Bataillon 32. In Berlin, the documents landed on the desk of some of the most experienced intelligence analysts in the German military. These weren't amateurs. These were men who had spent their entire careers evaluating information, detecting forgeries, and uncovering enemy deceptions. The head of German military intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, reviewed the documents personally. So did officers from the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. They examined every detail, and here's what they saw. Documents that appeared completely authentic. The paper was correct. The ink was correct. The signatures matched known samples. The bureaucratic language was exactly right. Boring, detailed, full of the minor complaints and administrative concerns that fill real military correspondence. But they went deeper. They investigated Major William Martin. They checked with their agents in Britain. Did this officer exist? The answer came back, yes. Records showed a Royal Marine officer by that name. He had the right service history. He had been stationed at Combined Operations Headquarters, exactly where someone carrying such documents would work. They even checked the personal details. The fiancée, Pam, the jewelry store receipt, the bank overdraft. Every detail they investigated confirmed the story. But German intelligence was thorough. They asked the critical question, could this be a deception? They considered the possibility. The British were known for clever tricks, but could they really create such an elaborate fake identity? Could they fake all these documents so perfectly? Could they plant a body with such precise timing? The German analysts debated. Some were suspicious, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every check they performed confirmed the story. And the documents contained exactly the kind of information they would expect from genuine Allied planning papers. Moreover, the documents made strategic sense. Greece was important for controlling the Balkans. Sardinia would give the Allies a base for operations in Italy. Sicily as a diversion? That was actually clever thinking. After days of analysis, German intelligence made their decision. The documents were genuine. The orders went out immediately. German forces in Greece were reinforced. Troops that had been positioned in Sicily were redeployed. Coastal defenses in Sardinia were strengthened. The German High Command was convinced they had discovered the Allied invasion plan. Adolf himself reviewed the intelligence and agreed with the assessment. He ordered specific preparations based on the captured documents. In London, British intelligence waited anxiously for confirmation. Were the Germans taking the bait? Then, the ultra-intercepts began arriving. The British had broken the German Enigma code, allowing them to read encrypted German military communications. And those communications told them everything they needed to know. German commanders were discussing the reinforcement of Greece. They were moving troops away from Sicily. They were preparing defenses exactly where the fake documents had suggested. On May 14, 1943, Montagu sent a message to Winston Churchill himself. Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker. The operation had worked. The Germans had completely believed the deception. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next shows just how completely this operation destroyed German confidence. Chapter 5. The Invasion and the Collapse of Trust. 32 out of 42 Napper. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky began. The Allied invasion of Sicily. Over 160,000 troops landed on the beaches. They expected fierce resistance, They prepared for massive casualties. After all, Sicily was the obvious target. Everyone knew the Germans would defend it heavily, but something strange happened. The resistance was lighter than expected. German forces were present, but not in the overwhelming numbers intelligence had predicted. Defensive positions existed, but not the extensive fortifications that should have been there. The invasion succeeded far beyond the Allies' most optimistic projections. Within 38 days, Sicily was captured. Casualties were significant, but far lower than if the Germans had been fully prepared. In Berlin, German intelligence analysts stared at reports from Sicily in disbelief. How had they gotten it so wrong? The documents they had recovered clearly stated that Sicily was a diversion. Greece was supposed to be the main target. They pulled out the documents from Major Martin's briefcase. They reviewed every detail again. The paper, the signatures, the personal effects. Everything had checked out perfectly. And that's when the horrible realization began to dawn on them. They had been deceived. Completely, thoroughly, brilliantly deceived. But here's what made it even worse. They couldn't be certain. Even after the Sicily invasion, even knowing they had been wrong, the German analysts couldn't definitively prove the documents were fake. That's how good the deception had been. This uncertainty was devastating. Because if they couldn't trust their own analysis of such seemingly perfect intelligence, what could they trust? Think about what this means for an intelligence service. Your entire purpose is to separate truth from lies, to find real information hidden among deception. And suddenly you realize that the most perfect, most thoroughly verified intelligence you've ever captured was completely false. Every document you examine from that point forward is suspect. Every agent report might be planted. Every piece of information could be part of another elaborate deception. German intelligence had been psychologically shattered. The German officers who had analyzed the Major Martin documents were interrogated. How could they have been so wrong? Some were reassigned. Others fell under suspicion themselves. Perhaps they were actually working for the Allies. The paranoia spread. Admiral Canaris himself fell under increasing suspicion. The entire Abwehr intelligence service was regarded with distrust, but the damage went beyond just intelligence operations. German military planning had been compromised. They had moved troops based on false information. Those troops had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Soldiers had been lost because of a dead body and some fake papers. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound. They had believed themselves superior in the intelligence game. They had sophisticated analysis methods, experienced officers, a reputation for thoroughness, and they had been completely outsmarted by a corpse in a briefcase. From that point forward, every piece of intelligence the Germans received was examined with excessive caution, which sounds good, but actually paralyzed decision-making. When you can't trust any information, you can't make decisive plans. The Allies, of course, knew exactly what effect Operation Mincemeat was having. The ultra-intercepts allowed them to read German communications and see the doubt, the confusion, the second-guessing, and they used that advantage ruthlessly. Chapter 6. The Hidden Details They Never Expected, 42-52. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. There were details about Operation Mincemeat that the Germans never discovered. Details that show just how elaborate this deception really was. Remember Pam, Major Martin's fiancée? The woman in the photograph? Her real name was Jean Leslie. She worked in the office with the intelligence team. She had no idea her photograph would be used this way until after the operation succeeded. The love letters supposedly written by Pam, they were actually composed by a secretary named Hester Leggett, who had a natural talent for writing romantic correspondence. She wrote multiple drafts until Montague was satisfied they sounded authentic enough. The photograph itself was interesting. Jean Leslie posed for it specifically for this operation. She was told to look affectionate but not overly romantic, like a real fiancé sending a photo to her officer boyfriend. But here's a detail that shows the incredible attention to the operation. They had Jean wear a specific type of clothing that would have been fashionable in 1943, but not too fashionable. Major Martin wasn't wealthy, so his fiancée wouldn't be wearing expensive designer items. The receipt for the engagement ring? A real jeweler was involved. They created an authentic receipt, backdated appropriately, for a ring that cost $50, expensive enough to be serious, but not so expensive that a junior officer couldn't afford it. The theater ticket stubs. They came from an actual London theater. Someone on the team had actually attended the show and saved the stubs specifically for this purpose. Even the bank's letter about his overdraft was crafted with care. They made sure the amount overdrawn wasn't too large. Major Martin was careless with money, not financially irresponsible. But here's one of the most clever details. They included a letter from Major Martin's father. Not a real father, of course. The man who had provided the body had no living father. But this fake father's letter was brilliant. It was written in an old-fashioned style, slightly pompous, full of minor complaints about wartime rationing and changes in society. It mentioned Martin's mother's health concerns. It contained advice about his upcoming marriage, the kind of well-meaning but slightly irritating fatherly advice every son has received. This letter served multiple purposes. It added depth to Martin's background. It suggested he came from a respectable family, and it gave German analysts another document to verify, which they did, finding nothing suspicious. They even worried about the body's fingerprints. What if the Germans tried to match them to military records? So they created a complete service file for Major Martin, including a fingerprint card. If the Germans checked, they would find matching prints. The Germans never checked the fingerprints. But the team didn't know they wouldn't, so they prepared for every possibility. There was even concern about dental records. What if the Germans compared the body's teeth to military dental records? Again, they prepared fake records just in case. Every conceivable detail was considered. Every possible way the Germans might verify the story was anticipated and addressed. But here's the most remarkable thing. The operation almost failed multiple times, and the Germans never knew how close they came to discovering the truth. Chapter 7. The Near Disasters, 52-62 are. Let me tell you about the things that almost went catastrophically wrong. First, there was the problem with the body itself. Glyndwr Michael had died from rat poison. This was not an ideal cause of death for someone who was supposed to have drowned in a plane crash. The poison could potentially be detected in an autopsy. The team consulted with pathologists. Would the poison still be detectable after the body had been in seawater for several days? The experts weren't certain. It was a calculated risk. Fortunately, the Spanish doctor who performed the autopsy in Huelva wasn't looking for poison. He was expecting drowning, and the condition of the body was consistent with drowning, so that's what he concluded. But if he had been more thorough, if he had run additional tests, the entire deception could have collapsed. Second, there was a problem with timing. The body needed to be in the water long enough to appear convincingly drowned, but not so long that advanced decomposition would make the documents unreadable or raise questions about the timing of the supposed plane crash. The team calculated that the body could be in the water for roughly 3 to 5 days maximum. Any longer and the deception would become obvious. But ocean currents are unpredictable. What if the body got caught in the wrong current and didn't wash ashore? What if it took a week instead of a few days? What if it simply sank? They couldn't control the ocean. All they could do was choose the best location, release the body at the right tide, and hope. As it turned out, the body washed ashore within the optimal time frame. But this was partly luck. If the currents had been slightly different, the entire operation would have failed. Third, there was the submarine itself. HMS Seraph had to surface in enemy-controlled waters to deploy the body. If they had been spotted by patrol aircraft or ships, the submarine would have been attacked. The operation would have been exposed. Lieutenant Jewell kept the submarine on the surface for the minimum time necessary. Even so, those 30 minutes were incredibly dangerous. They were completely vulnerable. Fourth, and this is the one that really could have destroyed everything, there was a Spanish fisherman who witnessed the body being recovered from the water. This fisherman saw Spanish authorities finding the body and removing the briefcase. He noticed how interested they were in the papers, and he talked about it in the local tavern. British intelligence learned about this fisherman weeks after the operation. They were terrified. If German agents in Spain had talked to this fisherman, if they had learned too many details about how and where the body was found, they might have become suspicious. But apparently, no German agent ever interviewed the fisherman. Or if they did, they didn't think his observations were important enough to report. Pure luck. Fifth, there was the problem of the British reaction. The naval attaché in Madrid had to act anxious and desperate about recovering the documents, but not too anxious. If he seemed too eager, the Spanish might become suspicious about why these documents were so important. It was a delicate balance. Show enough concern to convince the Germans the documents were valuable, but not so much concern that it seemed staged. The attaché performed his role perfectly, but he was walking a tightrope the entire time. Sixth, and this is one that few people know about, there was actually a second body prepared in case the first attempt failed. That's right. The team had a backup plan. If Major Martin's body had not been found, or if something had gone wrong, they had another deceased person ready to deploy with a different set of documents. They never needed to use the backup. But the fact that they prepared one shows how important this operation was considered. And finally, there was the biggest risk of all, the risk that German intelligence would simply be too competent to fool. The Abwehr had sophisticated analysis methods. They had experienced officers. They had access to resources throughout Europe. They were not easy to deceive. The success of Operation Mincemeat depended on creating a deception so perfect that even the best intelligence service in Europe couldn't detect it. And they succeeded, but it was close. Several German analysts expressed doubts. Some argued the documents seemed too convenient, but the weight of evidence was so strong, the details were so perfect, that the skeptics were overruled. If even one more analyst had pushed harder, if one more person had demanded additional verification, the entire deception might have been uncovered. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and Legacy, 62-72. After the success of the Sicily invasion, Operation Mincemeat remained classified for years. The operatives who planned it couldn't tell anyone what they had accomplished. Cholmondeley and Montague returned to regular duties, carrying the secret of their success. Glyndwr Michael, the man whose body played such a crucial role, was buried in Spain. His grave marker reads, William Martin, to this day, maintaining the deception even in death. His real identity wasn't revealed until decades after the operation ended. But the impact of Operation Mincemeat extended far beyond Sicily. It changed how intelligence operations were conducted for generations to come. Military deception became an art form. Intelligence services worldwide studied Operation Mincemeat as the gold standard for strategic deception. Every detail of how it was planned and executed became training material. But more importantly, it changed the psychology of intelligence work. Before Operation Mincemeat, intelligence services generally assumed that if they could verify multiple aspects of a piece of information, it was probably genuine. The operation proved that a sufficiently elaborate deception could create a false reality that would pass every verification test. This realization transformed intelligence analysis. From that point forward, analysts had to consider not just whether information could be verified, but whether the entire scenario might be a carefully constructed deception. It made intelligence work more difficult, more paranoid, but ultimately more sophisticated. For Germany specifically, the impact was devastating and long-lasting. The Abwehr never fully recovered its confidence. Officers who had analyzed the Major Martin documents faced career consequences. The entire service fell under suspicion. In fact, some historians argue that Operation Mincemeat contributed to the downfall of Admiral Canaris himself. His inability to detect such an elaborate deception made leadership question his competence. Within a year, the Abwehr was being absorbed into the SS Security Service, and Canaris himself would eventually face execution for alleged conspiracy. The paranoia created by Operation Mincemeat extended to other German intelligence operations. When genuine information was obtained, analysts second-guessed themselves. Was this another deception? Another elaborate fake? This paralysis of analysis proved devastating in later stages of the conflict. When the Allies prepared for D-Day in 1944, German intelligence received multiple warnings about the real invasion plans. But they couldn't trust the information. They remembered how confidently they had believed the Major Martin documents and how catastrophically wrong they had been. So when accurate intelligence about the D-Day landings arrived, German commanders hesitated. They couldn't be certain. They remembered Sicily, and that hesitation cost them the ability to respond effectively to the actual invasion. Operation Mincemeat had created a shadow of doubt that haunted German intelligence for the remainder of the conflict. Chapter 9. The Human Cost and Moral Questions, 72-80. But let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in the celebration of this operation's brilliance: the ethical complexity. Glinder Michael was a real person, a man who died in tragic circumstances, poverty and accidental poisoning. His body was used without his consent, though his family apparently agreed to the use of his remains for unspecified national service purposes. Was this justified? Is it ethical to use a deceased person's body as a tool of deception, even in wartime? The British intelligence team wrestled with this question. They were not comfortable with what they were doing, but they believed, and history proved them correct, that this deception would save thousands of lives. If Operation Mincemeat caused German forces to be in the wrong place during the Sicily invasion, how many Allied soldiers survived who would otherwise have died? Hundreds? Thousands? From a utilitarian perspective, using one body to save thousands of lives seems clearly justified. But ethics aren't always that simple. There's also the question of the deception itself. Major Martin's fictional fiancée, Pam, was given a personality and emotions. German intelligence analysts reading those love letters saw a human being. They believed in her existence, in her feelings, in her wedding plans. Was creating such an elaborate emotional fake, making enemy analysts feel they were glimpsing a real person's private life, was that a form of psychological manipulation that crosses ethical lines? Montague and Cholmondeley would have argued that in total conflict, deception is not just acceptable but necessary. Every successful deception means fewer soldiers dying on beaches, fewer families receiving the notification letters. But the operation also reveals something uncomfortable about intelligence work: the complete instrumentalization of human life and human emotion in service of strategic goals. The Germans who analyzed the documents weren't monsters. They were professional intelligence officers doing their jobs. The operation deliberately exploited their professionalism, their thoroughness, their human tendency to see patterns and believe in evidence. When they discovered they had been deceived, some of these men faced serious consequences. Careers destroyed, reputations ruined. Some possibly faced worse fates in the paranoid final years of the German regime. Were they victims of the operation, or simply casualties in a conflict they had chosen to serve? These are not easy questions, and I don't pretend to have simple answers, but they're worth considering when we celebrate the brilliance of Operation Mincemeat. The operation was strategically brilliant. It saved lives. It shortened the conflict. But it also shows how in wartime, everything, even death, even love, even human identity, becomes weaponized in service of victory. Chapter 10. The Lessons That Echo Today, 80-90. So what can we learn from Operation Mincemeat in 2025, more than 80 years after the operation took place? First, the power of detail. The operation succeeded because every tiny detail was considered and perfected. In a world of sophisticated verification methods, in an age of forensic analysis and database cross-referencing, the lesson remains. If you're going to create a deception, it must be absolutely complete. But here's the flip side. If you're trying to detect deception, you must look beyond the obvious. Just because every detail checks out doesn't mean the overall picture is genuine. This lesson applies far beyond military intelligence. We live in an age of deep fakes and sophisticated digital manipulation. Operation Mincemeat reminds us that the most dangerous deceptions are the ones where every detail appears correct, the ones where verification methods confirm the false narrative. Second, the importance of understanding human psychology. The operation worked because Montague and Cholmondeley understood how German analysts would think. They anticipated the questions that would be asked and prepared answers for all of them. This psychological understanding, knowing how your opponent thinks, what they'll check, what they'll find convincing, remains crucial in any competitive or adversarial situation. Third, the value of creativity in problem solving. The Allied commanders faced an impossible problem. Everyone knew where they would invade. Traditional military solutions weren't working. It took creative, unconventional thinking to find an answer. How many problems in business, in politics, in personal life seem impossible until someone approaches them from a completely different angle? Fourth, the danger of overconfidence. The German analysts were thorough and professional, but they were also confident in their methods. That confidence made them vulnerable to a deception that satisfied all their verification procedures. In any field where you're evaluating information, whether you're an investor checking a company's claims, a journalist verifying a source, or a consumer reading online reviews, remember that confidence in your methods can be exploited by sophisticated deception. Fifth, the long-term psychological impact of being deceived. The German intelligence service never fully recovered. Once you discover you've been thoroughly fooled, you lose faith in your ability to distinguish truth from lies. This applies personally, too. Whether in relationships, business partnerships, or any situation involving trust, a significant deception doesn't just affect that one situation. It creates lasting doubt that affects all future judgments. Sixth, the ethical complexity of deception, even when serving a good cause. Operation Mincemeat saved lives. It was clearly the right decision strategically, but it involved using a deceased person's body, creating fake emotional relationships, and deliberately exploiting professional dedication. Sometimes the right choice is still ethically complicated. Recognizing that complexity, rather than pretending difficult decisions are simple, is a form of moral maturity. Seventh, the importance of preparation for multiple scenarios. Remember, the British had a backup body prepared in case the first attempt failed. They thought through every possible way the operation could go wrong and prepared contingencies. This kind of thorough contingency planning applies to any significant undertaking. Hope for the best outcome, but prepare for the alternatives. Eighth, the power of persistence against overwhelming odds. The Allied situation in early 1943 was desperate. They needed a miracle. Instead of accepting defeat or hoping for luck, intelligence officers created that miracle through careful planning and execution. When facing overwhelming challenges, sometimes the solution isn't to give up or hope for external circumstances to change, but to create new possibilities through creative action. Ninth, the value of secrecy and patience. The success of Operation Mincemeat depended on keeping it secret not just during execution, but for years afterward. The operatives couldn't tell anyone about their success. They had to watch Sicily invaded, watch the consequences of their work, and say nothing. In an age of instant social media sharing, where every accomplishment is immediately broadcast, there's something powerful about the patience to keep significant achievements private. And finally, 10th, perhaps the most important lesson, in any conflict, whether military, business, or personal, the side that controls information and perception has an enormous advantage. The Allies didn't just deceive Germany about one operation. They created lasting doubt that affected German decision-making for the remainder of the conflict. Information warfare, the battle to control what your opponent believes to be true, can be more decisive than physical confrontation. Conclusion, 90-96. So there you have it, the complete story of Operation Mincemeat. A dead body, a fake identity, a briefcase full of lies, and the complete psychological destruction of one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence services. In that cold Berlin office in April 1943, those German analysts thought they had captured a crucial secret. They thought their thoroughness and professionalism had given them a decisive advantage. They had no idea they were holding exactly what the Allies wanted them to find. They checked every detail. They verified every fact. They did everything right according to their training and experience. And that's exactly why the deception worked. By the time they realized the truth, if they ever fully realized it, the damage was done. Not just the strategic damage of misplaced troops and wasted resources, but the psychological damage of shattered confidence. How do you trust your analysis when the most thoroughly verified intelligence you ever captured turned out to be completely fabricated? You don't. You can't. And that doubt, that loss of confidence, affects every decision you make afterward. Operation Mincemeat didn't just help win one battle. It helped win the entire psychological conflict. The men who planned it, Cholmondeley and Montague, were not generals or famous commanders. They were creative thinkers who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't military force, but carefully constructed illusion. The man whose body made it possible, Glyndwr Michael, died in poverty and obscurity, but his final act of service, unknowing though it was, changed the course of history. And the German intelligence officers who were deceived? They were competent professionals who did their jobs exactly as they were trained to do. They just happened to face an enemy who understood their methods perfectly and exploited them brilliantly. In 1943, German spies lost all hope because they realized they couldn't trust anything anymore. Every document could be fake. Every agent could be a plant. Every piece of intelligence could be a deception. That uncertainty, that loss of confidence, was perhaps more devastating than any military defeat. And it all started with a dead body, a briefcase, and the most perfectly crafted lie in history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, share this video with anyone interested in history, intelligence, or the strange ways that creativity and careful planning can change the world. And leave a comment. What do you think about the ethics of Operation Mincemeat? Was it justified? Would you have approved it if you were in command? History is full of bizarre stories like this. Stories where the truth is stranger than anything you'd believe in fiction. Stories where ordinary people make extraordinary decisions that echo through decades. This is just one of them. There are so many more to tell. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest victories come not from the strongest force, but from the smartest deception. And always question what you think you know for certain. Because somewhere, someone might be crafting a perfect lie specifically designed to fool people exactly like you. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next video.